Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Vraks Finale Week. Last time we were looking at most of the assault upon the final citadel, the clearing of the St. Leonis Basilica, and the reclaiming of the Priory of the Argent Shroud, from which Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex was now preparing to strike out against the last bastion, which he suspected to be housing a Chaos Warp Gate. In the Basilica of St. Leonis, interrogator chaplain Belphegor had gained his prize. The Alpha Legion Lord Arcos, having received not one, not two, but 3 power maul hits to the head, was somehow miraculously still alive and in Dark Angel custody. But the business of the chapter, via the proxy of the Angels of Absolution, was not quite over yet. They still needed to hunt down and destroy the Anarchy's heart. And to do this, the battle barge Liberatory Delictum had been sent out to hunt it, utilizing the strike cruiser and one of the 2 escort vessels in the fleet as bait, whilst the other escort and the battle barge would stand by ready to intercept the Anarchy's heart if it made for the strike cruiser, or if it went for Vraks itself, in an attempt to rescue its master. Of course, there was also the possibility that the ancient battleship would not show at all, but that was a risk they'd have to take. If necessary, the Angels of Absolution Strike Force was prepared to trawl the outer asteroid belts looking for it, although they would prefer not to, since such an operation would, in all due likelihood, be very time-consuming. The Anarchy's heart was massive, but when compared to the infinite vastness of space, it was but little more than a speck of dust. It was, however, imperative that they did find it. The supposed reason was because the Angels of Absolution was worried about the Anarchy's heart raiding the 88th supply lines, and that the Anarchy's heart might slip away and inconvenience other areas of the Imperium by preying upon its trade lanes. But as always, with any force involving the Dark Angels, no matter how distant their involvement might be, there was of course a few secondary objectives in play as well. The Anarchy's heart was known to be the flagship of Lord Arcos, and any secrets that might be dug from his brain might also be present in the Anarchy's databanks. And that was the kind of information the Angels did not want anybody else to lay eyes upon. Originally, the idea had been that maybe, just maybe, the Anarchy's heart could be seized. With most of its Alpha Legion personnel undoubtedly deployed to Vraks, it would be fairly lightly manned, and the Angels of Absolution Strike Force would be more than enough to overcome any last-ditch defense aboard the battleship. But it had become necessary to deploy the strike force earlier than anticipated, due to the presence of the Lord Inquisitor. It was best, it was thought, to secure Lord Arcos the primary prize before the Lord Inquisitor got any ideas. The Dark Angels had dealt with his kind before, and whilst they had their ways to ensure that they did not overly inconvenience the chapter, they wished to avoid those means, if possible, since they usually came with a bit of a fallout attached. Very well then. The Anarchy's heart would be destroyed. Better that than to risk that information falling into the wrong hands, since that could seriously inconvenience the chapter. The only question that remained then was, would the Anarchy's heart cooperate? Would it reveal itself coming out of hiding, and risk running the gauntlet of the Imperial Navy and the battle barge and strike cruiser? The Anarchy's heart was a massive beast, and it had proven in previous fleet engagements that it was not to be underestimated. But a battle barge, a strike cruiser, and 2 escort ships should be more than enough. Should. Then, finally, the wait came to an end. At 288330 Millennia 41, the strike cruiser Repentance long-range augers detected an energy spike that could only be the Despoiler-class battleship. The vessel was, as the Angels had anticipated, headed towards Vraks, doubtlessly in some misguided attempt to rescue its master, unaware of the pickle that Lord Arcos had found himself in. The repeated pickle straight to the face, in fact. That would bring it directly into the path of Liberatori Delictum, and with the strike cruiser Repentant right on its ass, the Anarchy's heart would really have to pull out all the stops if it had any hopes of getting out of this one. Unfortunately, the Anarchy's heart might just be all out of stops. Oh, how the mighty have fallen indeed. The huge attack craft's main weaponry once was wings of attack crafts, fighters and bombers launched from its many hangars. But those had been bled to death down on the surface of Vraks like so many other things, shot down one by one during a lengthy, grueling air campaign by the Imperial Navy. This would have to be a good old-fashioned gunnery duel. And whilst once again the Anarchy's heart was certainly not undergunned, it was now facing a battle barge, something far heavier than it had ever encountered previously in the Vraxian sector. Nevertheless, the Anarchy's heart did not back down. It advanced straight towards the battle barge the moment it encountered it, opening fire with its long-range weaponry at maximum range. As the shells began to strike upon the Liberatori Delictum's forward void shields, it too was ordered to return fire. The Anarchy's heart may have been tempted to attempt a skirmish with the battle barge if its complement of fighters and bombers was still intact, but, well, if wishes were horses, all men would ride thoroughbreds. Instead, the Anarchy's heart hove to starboard, presenting its full broadside firepower to the encroaching Liberatori Delictum, hoping to end this with a massed volley of lancers and bombardment cannons. And it was imperative that it make short work of the Astartes battle barge, since the strike cruiser Repentant was closing upon its rearward quarters at considerable speeds. And then there were the escorts. If the Anarchy's heart got caught up with the strike cruiser and the battle barge, its ability to maneuver would be severely hindered, and the torpedoes from the escorts would suddenly become far more dangerous. But for now, both of the vessels were ordered to stand back. They would leap into action if it became advantageous for them, but as previous engagements in the Vraxian sector had demonstrated, vessels of that kind of tonnage would not survive long against the Anarchy's heart. So for now, it would be a duel. The Anarchy's heart drew first blood, its massive weaponry hammering into the forward void shields of the Liberatori Delictum. The void shields strained as they attempted to resist the titanic energies being unleashed upon them, but one by one they began to fail, and the forward armor section of the battle barge started taking hits. Meters upon meters of armor were scoured away and torn spinning into the void, and finally, there was a telling hit. One of the Anarchy's lance batteries struck a section of armor already weakened, melted its way through yet another dozen meters of armor plating, and struck deep into the vessel's forward quarters, setting multiple fires and forcing whole sections of the battle barge to be vented of oxygen. But the Liberatori Delictum was now getting dangerously close. A Space Marine battle barge is designed for close quarters engagements. Usually it would prefer to finish off a wounded opponent with a boarding action, as they usually lack the kind of heavy long-range firepower of true battleships. But since that was not an option in this case, the Liberatori would simply have to make the most out of it. And make no mistake, In a close-range fight, a battle barge still packs a ferocious amount of firepower, which it now began to unleash into the anarchy's heart. Macro batteries, missile racks, fusion beamers, and plasma weaponries of all description now began firing in staged volleys, first stripping the ancient vessel of its void shields and then targeting vital subsystems, in this case paying particular attention to the massive engines powering the anarchy's heart. As the anarchy attempted to turn to keep its broadside pointed towards the battle barge, and the battle barge attempted to keep its heaviest armored front section towards the anarchy, the battle barge for a moment gained the upper hand, maneuvering just right, displaying the centuries of battle experience undoubtedly possessed by the Space Marine captain aboard. It got into just the right position to deploy all of its weaponry in a devastating salvo against the anarchy's engine aurum. And in a monstrous detonation of unimaginable energy, one of the anarchy's heart's massive engines was torn clean off the ancient heretical vessel, severely hampering its maneuverability and speed. In equal parts outrage and a note of panic, the anarchy's heart tore into the battle barge again, but the void shields being brought back online as quickly as the engine sayers could manage, and the massive, heavily armored plating of the battle barge withstood yet another furious volley from the anarchy's heart. And that was all the chance the ancient monster would have. It had not finished off the battle barge, and the strike cruiser Repentant was now in range. The Space Marine vessel had been closing on the battle ever since the anarchy's heart had been detected, and it had been doing so at full burn. The Repentant was now riding on a tremendous amount of energy, which it used to cut right across the rearward portions of the anarchy's heart, pouring all of its firepower into the now vulnerable engine decks, having already been torn open by the Liberatori Delictum. And into that open, unguarded space, the Repentant now poured all of its firepower, not only crippling the anarchy's remaining engines, but also blasting through meters of armor and bulkheads, reaching all the way into the rearward plasma reactor, annihilating it. This sent secondary and tertiary explosions ravaging up and down the anarchy's heart. It had also lost all propulsion and virtually all maneuverability. The heretical Leviathan attempted to turn slowly and ponderously, but it no longer had the energy to do so well. The battle barge and the strike cruiser could easily stay out of the arcs of its main weapon batteries and simply circled the ancient vessel, picking it apart with their macro cannons and bombardment weaponry. The Liberatori Delictum closing into point-blank range and firing its bombardment cannons into the exposed spine of the vessel. The Chaos battleship's void shields strained against the repeated impacts, but unable to bring any weaponry to bear to force the battle barge to change position. It was only a question of time. First one void shield flickered out of existence, then another, and then a third, and they did not come back online again. The battle barge simply continued hammering the ancient vessel from prow to stern. Methodically, slowly, and controlledly, it was destroying every last section of the anarchy's heart, eventually touching off yet another plasma reactor, sending another huge engine block blasting out into space. The anarchy's heart was dead. All that was left now was to ensure that it stopped twitching, and that nothing could ever be recovered from the wreckage. It would take another hour of unrelenting bombardment to finally reduce it to nothing more than debris and space dust. His mission finally complete, the captain of the Liberatori Delictum sent a single message down to the planet. "The beast is slain, Brother Chaplain. Its guns have gone silent at last." It had been a valiant effort on behalf of the despoiler class. The battle barge had not left this battle unscarred. Even now, after the battle was all over, the Space Marine vessels' damage control teams were still fighting to bring internal fires under control. The Liberatore Delictum would need a long period in an orbital dockyard to regain her full strength. But the Anarchy's heart would never again threaten the Imperium, and that was a victory worth celebrating. But once the war in the void might have been won, there was yet still one more action to be taken on the surface of Vraks. Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex had marshalled his Grey Knight strike force and now prepared to strike at the Western Bastion, the presumed last center of resistance on the entire planet. But the mere fact that it was the last did not mean that it would be easy. The relative lack of traitor legionnaire resistance in the rest of the Citadel led the Lord Inquisitor to believe that the warlord Sufor had withdrawn virtually all of his Chaos Space Marine forces to this bastion, including his own Skulltaker's warband, the Sanctified, and whatever other traitor legionnaire forces yet remained, with the exception of the Nurgle Marines. The Lord Inquisitor had yet to receive updated reports on that area of the front line, but he did know that fighting over there had been abating for quite some time, and there was the presumption that this meant that the enemy was withdrawing into the hinterlands or committing to other means of escape. But with the battle against the Citadel still raging, there had been no additional forces available to be dispatched to that sector to ensure that the enemy could not withdraw. And so that would have to be a problem for another day. The attempt upon the Bastion would be led by the Grey Knights, with the Lord Inquisitor partaking along with a handful of other selected individuals. It was expected to be a tough fight, even more so since the only bridge connecting the Bastion to the rest of the Citadel had long since been destroyed. And thusly, if the force ran into more opposition than it could deal with, extracting it would be very difficult. And so there was no point in holding back anything. The entire remnant of the Grey Knight strike force, led personally by Brother Captain Stern, would teleport into the Bastion via the Honoris Amentum's Teleportarum. Upon arrival, the strike force would then locate the position of the presumed warp gate via psychic means and head straight towards it. There was no reason to clear out the Bastion level by level. Once the portal was closed, the demons would either disappear or be so thoroughly weakened that even the mortal elements of the 88th could be trusted with dealing with them. The real problem was if anything had been bound to the portal, and the nature of the opposition. The Lord Inquisitor expected that he would be dealing with the remnants of the Warlord Zufor's warband, and hopefully the Warlord himself. But there was also the possibility that they had already fled through the warp gate, if it was stable enough. Again, fleeing through a warp gate is hardly the most guaranteed escape route, but it is an escape route. In doing so, however, they may also prepared some surprises for the Imperium. Access to a warp gate would allow Zufor's Demomancers and the Sanctified a wide array of options, too many to accurately predict. And so there was nothing for it. The Grey Knights would have to take a page out of the Death Course playbook, and simply commit themselves to the operation with imperfect intelligence. Theirs is not to question why, theirs is but to do or die. Seems to have become the planetary motto of Vraks at this point. And the Lord Inquisitor and his grey-armoured meat shields had plentiful reason to worry. Zufor had indeed realised that the gig on Vraks was up. After his arrival, necessary as it may have been to stabilize the situation at that point, from being utterly overrun by the 88, had then quickly deteriorated the entire defensive network on Vraks. The Alpha Legion had set up a ingenious system, allowing the surprisingly capable defense force on Vraks and its, again, surprisingly talented command staff to make the most out of their resources and their defensive works. They knew them better than anyone, and they had used them to the utmost effect, causing a great deal of trouble even for the 88th, the Death Corps of Krieg, at the height of their power and supply lines. Granted, at the time they were commanded by a buffoon, but a buffoon with 10,000 artillery pieces is still a considerable threat. But with Zephyr taking over operations, not only did he butcher the Vraxian High Command staff, he also tore the heart out of the resistance. Many of Vrax's defenders were still fighting because they felt that they had been in some way wronged, or that the Imperium had come to take away their savior in Cardinal Zaphon. Many of them had genuinely believed that this was the beginning of a great and glorious crusade. And whilst that very same saviour was slowly but surely indoctrinating the population via the advice of Deacon Mamoon into a very different way of thinking, with an entirely different pantheon, this was done very slowly, very subtly, almost hesitantly, in fact, outright hesitantly, because the very people proselytizing did not have a firm grip of the ideas that they were suggesting. This meant the defenders, although being slowly corrupted, still fought almost entirely as a professional, trained army, and whilst it may have come from humble origins, a decade or so of grinding, meticulous siege warfare had turned every last one of the Vraxian defenders into seasoned veterans. Their doctrines, their planning, their positions, and their ability to deal with the enemy's attacks had improved vastly from their humble origins. And even from the very start, the Vraxian command staff had shown a remarkable talent for improvising and deploying unusual solutions to unexpected problems. When Marshal Arnim Kagori began undermining the front line, the Vraxian response was swift and surprisingly expert. The Vraxian command staff, immediately realizing the threat posed towards them, began organizing their own countermining operation, utilizing the experience of the Workers' Auxiliary to organize ad hoc countermining teams, combined both with combat veterans and those highly skilled in operating machinery underground and also in the science of mining. And of course, we should not forget the brilliant riposte planned by the Vraxian command staff to counter the 88's very first breakthrough of their outer defensive line. The Vraxians had known that it was an inevitability that the 88 would eventually break through, and so they had envisioned a perfect response to that inevitability, which set the Death Corps back a good year or two at the very least, and could potentially have cost them far more dearly than it actually did. But when Zephyr began taking charge of things, first by unifying the various Chaos warbands, and then by rising up in betrayal against the Cardinal and the Vraxian Defense Force, that all changed. Almost all of the upper command echelon of the Vraxian defenders were murdered, and Cardinal Zaphon was taken away to be sacrificed in dark rituals. This, along with the now far more overt Chaos worship, had a devastating effect upon the defenders' morale. Those who still clung to some idea that they were not the bad guys in all of this, they now turned to despair. Their morale was almost completely shattered. They began withdrawing, they began surrendering, even though they knew that there would almost be no chance of them actually living through their surrender. The Imperium was not here to show mercy, and they knew that damn well after having fought said Imperium for over a decade. And yet, the evidence was clear for all to see. The remaining defences outside of the citadel walls fell with almost unseemly ease. Only in the east, where the true fanatics and the Nurgle Marines held the 30th Line Corps at bay, did they manage to hold on to their ground with some semblance of success. In the other areas, the Vraxian defenders were either deserting en masse, surrendering, running, or refusing to counterattack. And in many cases, it was not even a question of refusal, but the simple fact that the order never arrived, because there was no command staff left to issue it. And even with the Vraxian citadel itself, whilst the defenders were now in possession of some of the strongest defensive weaponry on all of Vraks, they were exceedingly poorly utilized. The Vraxian defenders had held the 88th in check for years, with considerably less effective defenses and spread a hell of a lot more thin. And yet, the siege of the final citadel did not even take a full year. The decline in the defenders' quality was more than evident. And in addition to this came the cornered warlord Zephor's own interpretation of how battles were best to be fought. He had essentially given up the idea of fighting the war with conventional means. All he sought to do now was to kill the maximum amount of men, regardless of whether or not they be friend or foe, in an effort to cause enough bloodshed and death to draw the eye of his patron deity, and also to summon yet more cornet demons, culminating in the summoning of Angergrath. That was supposed to be the trump card. It was supposed to be the winning move, the final move of the chess piece. Angergrath would have slaughtered the enemy attackers, and then, with his presence firmly established upon the planet, the legions of Khorne could begin flowing out of the warp gate and drown the defenders in tides of bloodthirsty monsters. But instead, the bloodthirster had been slain, and within hours of its arrival. And by offering up most of the remaining defenders in a hopeless mass charge from the Cardinal Gate, Zephor had also sacrificed the only remaining sizable force that could have yet held the citadel, as well as surrendering the Cardinal Gate to the enemy. From the point of view of a cornered fanatic, it all made perfect sense. But from a military and strategic viewpoint, Zephor had been a complete and utter disaster for the defenders. But hey, it's only fair that the bad guys get some shitty generals as well, eh? After all, the 88th had to suffer through Lord Commander Julka, and, let's face it, for all of his valuable contributions to the war, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex also was not much of a field commander. And for Zephor's finale, he would carry out a disappearance act. Having done everything he could to, well, kick everything over and set it on fire on Vraks, Zephor now decided that it was time to leave. And as one last, almost petulant act, he made sure that nobody would follow him. And when I say nobody, that also includes the Alpha Legion and the worshippers of Nurgle. His escape route, throwing himself through the warp gate and praying that Khorne still had a use for him, was hardly the perfect escape plan, but he would be damned if he let anybody else make use of it. And so he had the Sanctified bind another demon to the warp portal, a binding that would last for all eternity or until the portal itself was destroyed. And with Vraks being so rich in sacrifice, they could afford bringing through something special. A demon prince by the name of Uraka Warfiend. He and his servants of Khorne would now be bound to the portal forever. And once again, Zephor had long since realized that the war was lost, and that doing this would likely not even lengthen the war over much. It would, as mentioned, cut off the escape route for any of his other allies. As you can probably imagine, a demon prince, and one of Khorne in particular, bound to a post of eternal servitude and vigilance to a war portal, would probably be somewhat angry, more so than usual, and would be less than friendly towards any servants of the other ruinous powers who attempted to make use of it. Unbeknownst to Zephyr, of course, Lord Arcos was currently recovering after several heavy blows to the head. Say what you will about the Dark Angels, but I do kind of like the sheer presumption on display when it comes to the interrogator chaplain. The fact that he smashed his captured target 3 times in the head with a power weapon, never hesitating, that requires a certain certainty of purpose that is rare even among Space Marines. Anywho, the only ones who would be enjoying the pleasure of getting to know Urak Warfiend was the Lord Inquisitor and his Grey Knight strike force, who was set upon by hordes of demonic creatures the moment they materialized out of the warp after teleporting down into the bastion. Any hope that this would be a swift and decisive operation launched against a disorganized foe whose primary concern was fleeing were quickly dashed, and the Lord Inquisitor's worst fears were made manifest. These were not merely just summoned demonic monstrosities. This was an army, or as close to an army as Khorne, with his severe dislike of discipline, would ever come. There were juggernauts, bloodletters, and fleshhounds of Khorne, all inscribed with the same mark, that of a demon prince, and they were moving with uneary precision. They had clearly known that the Grey Knights were coming, and had prepared quite the reception for them. Of course, the bastion had been bombarded before the Grey Knights arrived, even with orbital weaponry and massive melted torpedoes, but, well, the bastion itself was a formidable defensive work, and seeing as the demons could appear out of the warp, they were unfortunately not obliged to sit prettily on the ground and wait to be blown away. They could, quite literally, just wait to appear until the enemy was there. Fortunately, the Inquisitor still had the right tool for the job. He must have been thanking his lucky star every day for the idea to bring along the Grey Knights. He had, of course, suspected demonic interference from day one. That was indeed the reason why he had seized control of the 88 in the first place, but his inquisitorial clout and the Grey Knight's willingness to cooperate, having placed 2 entire strike groups at his disposal, had been absolutely decisive for the war effort, especially as one had been almost completely destroyed by Angergrath. And in comparison to fighting that monster, this was easy. The enemy had the numbers, but they did not have the quality. And in the shattered ruins of the bastion, their numbers could not be utilized to their fullest. They had limited approaches, and they were all covered by squad upon squad of Grey Knights with weapons specialized to deal with just such a foe. Psy-cannons fired beams of iridescent psychic energy, sweeping through dozens of the monsters with every discharge. As each sector was swept clear by the unrelenting firepower of the Grey Knights, they gained entry into the bastion. Led in by purgation squads, wielding incinerators and holy promethium, they began working their way downwards towards the strongest psychic signature, clearing out corridor by corridor, whilst also fortifying the route behind them, by placing individual Terminator-armored Grey Knights down lengthy corridors or intersections, where each brother could become a veritable fortress in his own right. In this way, the Grey Knights came ever closer to the depths of the bastion, until finally they emerged into a large open room, with the giant demonic portal clearly visible on the other side of it. But in front of that portal stood a huge, horned behemoth, wielding a massive poleaxe and armored in infernal glowing brass. This, then, was the demon prince Uraka Warfiend. Shouting obscenities, he picked up his polearm and marched up to meet the Grey Knights. And as the first of them in the room, Brother Captain Stern raised his nemesis force weapon and marched to meet the demon prince. The Grey Knight captain drew first blood by unleashing a psychic blast into the demon, which rent a ragged wound in its shoulder. Staggering back for but a moment, the demon prince then lowered its shoulders and charged. Massive poleaxe raised high overhead, it brought it down a sweeping arc towards the brother captain, who barely stepped out of the way. The weapon buried itself in the permacrete below, cracking it viciously. The brother captain took this opportunity to launch a thrust with his force weapon into the demon's exposed flank as it was recovering its weapon. The force sword struck the demon prince's brass armor and was turned aside, impossibly so, skidding off the apparently flimsy protection of the demon prince. But, visible only to the psychic vision of Stern, the armor glowed unnaturally with runic force. The demon prince, freeing his weapon, spun away from the brother captain and jabbed swiftly with the spiked butt of the poleaxe, catching Stern square in his chest. The unnatural weapon pierced Terminator armor with ease and passed through the reinforced bone ribcage of the brother captain, piercing one of his hearts. Stumbling back from the blow, the brother captain attempted to recover, but the demon was too swift. Spinning its poleaxe above its head, it delivered another thunderous blow into the brother captain. He barely raised his force sword in time to avert a killing blow, but the sword was sent flying, and Stern was put square on his back, the demon prince now rearing above him, ready to finish off the Grey Knight captain. But Uraka had been too focused on his duel, and had not seen Justicar Ophir and his squad arriving in the room. The Grey Knights saw no reason to honor any duel with the demon, and so the entire squad opened up with their weaponry and unleashed their psychic powers into the demon, sending immaterial lightning and flames coursing across its body. Rearing back in pain, the demon prince roared, pointed its poleaxe towards its new adversaries, and prepared to charge them as well. But it had taken its eyes off its prey. Rising from the ground, Captain Stern, recovering his sword, swung it against the demon, catching it in its lower legs, lopping it off, and then, even as the demon fell backwards, he raised the force sword above his head and brought it crashing down upon the monster in mid-fall. And this time the demon prince's unnatural armor did not save it. Brass armor and demonic flesh parting with equal ease before the force weapon, which dug deep into the demonic creature's midriff, severing its spine and sending Uraka Warfiend's spirit hurling back into the immaterium. With the demon prince banished, his legions lost their connection to their lord. Becoming unorganized beasts once again, they now posed little real threat to the Grey Knights. Brother Captain Stern was down, possibly for good, but before they could see to him, Squad Ophir moved towards the warp gate and poured their psychic potential into its pillars, shattering the enchantment upon them and closing the warp rift once and for all. With their connection to the immaterium so suddenly and violently severed, the demons began winking out of existence and disappearing in clouds of sulphuric smoke. Shortly thereafter, Lord Hector Rex entered the room, his blade Arya having served him well once again, coated in the gore of demons. He saw Brother Captain Stern lying motionless on the floor, that last attack having claimed all strength that was left in his body. Squad Ophir was securing him and readying him for transport back up to the Honoris Amentum, where the Grey Knights apothecaries would do their best to ensure that their brother captain would fight again. But with this final action, the slaying of the Deamon and the closing of the warp gate, the war on Vraks was as good as over. There was a handful of resistance nests that still needed clearing out. The Cardinal's palace would still need a couple more days under the gentle attentions of the Red Scorpions before it could be declared safe. And then there was the Nurgle worshippers. With the Citadel fully neutralized, the 88th turned their full attention upon that pocket. It was closed in but a matter of days. Most of its defenders with any means to do so had already slipped away into the wastelands, the warp, or affected other means of escape. And then, at 4830 Millennia 41, the Siege of Vraks was officially declared to be at an end. And so our story as well is almost done. There will be one final video this week talking about the Siege of Vraks overall, and of course, the cost involved in winning it, and the consequences. If Vraks would ever fully be brought back into the Imperium's fold, and if it was to truly rejoin the Imperium, in what capacity would it do so? And of course, we will also see how the siege affected the Lord Inquisitor's career. He had risked everything taking command of the 88th, the enmity of his own order and that of Ordo Hereticus. He could very well have ended up just like his emissaries to the High Lords if he had shown any signs of weakness, or that the war was going to fail, or even simply just drag on for longer than his political adversaries would like to see it. And there is also the fate of the 6 Adepta Sororitas rescued, and I use that word in its most general meaning possible, from their cells beneath the Priory of the Argent Shroud, only to be put in marginally more comfortable cells aboard an inquisitorial vessel. All that and more in the final episode of the Siege of Vraks. But with this, the war itself is at an end. After 18 years of grueling siege warfare, the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army finally stood victorious. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you one last time in the epilogue. Have a good day.